Welcome to Devotionables, brief devotions for busy people. My name is David, and today we're concluding our series on the book of Ruth. In this video, my overarching question is this: why is the book of Ruth in your Bible at all? The scenes are so small town, with little going on. The people involved initially appear to be common people, of little consequence. The question I'm posing, therefore, is quite natural. Why is the book of Ruth in your Bible? To answer this, we're going to end up in the last 4 verses of Ruth, which are a strange way, admittedly, to end a book. So first, we're going to zoom out, and we're going to start from the beginning of the book. As we turn to the book of Ruth in our Bibles, we notice that it comes after the book of Judges. The author of Ruth emphasizes this reality in the first verse, where it says, "In the days when the judges ruled." Now, do you remember what the period of the judges was like? Go ahead and run through that in your mind. They entered the promised land, but parents didn't raise their children to follow the Lord. And so everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And the downward spiral from there continues, where the people sin, and God judges them by allowing other nations to overrun them. And the people cry out for help, and God sends a judge to deliver them. The spiritual and moral decline throughout the book is evident in, for instance, how Samson, the last judge, makes no pretense of following the Lord and seems to deliver the people in spite of himself. And it's also evident in that by the end, tribes are warring against themselves and rank immorality is the norm. Meanwhile, the book of Ruth, during the descent of God's people into godlessness, the first section of Ruth introduces us to a family of a man named Elimelech, whose name means, "My God is King." Just as Elimelech dies at the beginning of Ruth, Israel's concept of God as their king is dying in the period of the Judges. Perhaps a picture of Israel's departure from the Lord, this Bethlehemite has now made his home in Moab. Fast forwarding, the Lord brought what was left of Elimelech's family, Naomi and Ruth, back to Bethlehem by causing the famine to cease and the land to be fruitful, just like he would later cause the barrenness of Ruth's womb to become fruitful. More on that later. Now, Naomi, whose name means my kindness or my favor, asks to be called bitter because of her sorrow. But the author of the story continues to call her my favor, and I think this suggests that even though they were going through dark days and probably doubted the Lord's favor, nevertheless, as we see throughout the book, the Lord has favor on commonplace people, the ones that are in our story, and you and me. Even in the darkness, then, even in the wake of loss of family members and the threat of the end of their own family name, the Lord is still sovereignly working. Remember this: Ruth happens to return to Bethlehem around the time of the harvest, and happens to visit the field of Boaz, who happens to love the Lord, and who happens to be a relative, you can hear all this, right? Who happens to even redeem Ruth and Naomi and be able to perpetuate Elimelech's name. So you may be tempted to doubt in your own darkness the Lord's kindness and favor in dark times. Don't give in. Remember the story of Ruth. God was still working. So now, we turn in our Bibles to Ruth 4. And the author of Ruth reports Boaz beckoning his relative, "Come here, so-and-so," in verse 1. Now, many English translations render that friend, but the idiom used means so-and-so, or as the NET puts it, Mr. What's Your Name? Now, here's the point of that. The author is making a striking point. Because of this worldly wise relative, and his refusal to perpetuate the name of his kindred, his name is now forgotten. Because Boaz determined to love his kindred, to his own financial hurt, his name is now known, remembered, and celebrated by millions upon millions of Christians. Be like Boaz. All of this and more has been part of God's plan. Now notice also in chapter 4, as we get up to our passage at the end, verses 11 and 12, the witnesses pray surprisingly that Boaz's house would be like the house of Perez, his ancestor, who was fathered by a foreigner named Tamar. Genesis 38, for those of you who want to look it up. Now remember, Perez was born because Judah's sons were wicked and worldly, just like Mr. So-and-so. They refused to perpetuate the name of Judah's firstborn. And Judah unintentionally became the redeemer by Tamar because Judah was looking for a prostitute. Even in that pivotal moment, in spite of all the scandal, Judah is Judah becomes repentant. He becomes a servant leader. He ends up offering himself in the place of Benjamin by the end of Genesis. And that's a really interesting connection that the author of Ruth would even make a connection to Perez. And that brings us to our genealogy. Now, we found out in verse 17 that Ruth is King David's great-grandma. The genealogy tells us more about what the author is getting at, though. Not only does the book of Ruth bridge the gap between Judges and 1 Samuel by explaining what God was doing in the meantime, of course, namely preserving a worthy line in the tribe of Judah to raise up David and eventually Jesus, but the author also begins the genealogy with Perez, which is just striking. God has surprisingly turned this event, just like the scandal of Genesis 38, into a good future for his people. God turned the famine, the deaths, Mr. So-and-so's abject failure, Ruth's decade-long barrenness into good for his people, preparing the way for David. You notice the phrase, "these are the generations of"? That reaches back to Genesis, where that was a theme that Moses used to point out the next development in the line of family from Adam all the way to the one that Moses was anticipating would crush the head of the serpent. That phrase reaches forward in our Bibles to Matthew 1:1. In Matthew 1:1, we see the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And it's also, when we compare it with Ruth's, interesting. Boaz probably had sympathy towards Ruth, who was a foreigner, because Boaz's mom is another famous foreigner that you've heard of, Rahab. That's right. The three non-Israelite women in Matthew's genealogy are all involved in this story in Ruth to bring about the best king of Israel before Jesus. And all of this, mind you, happens before Israel sinfully asks for a king like every other nation in 1 Samuel 8. This means that God has been working in the background, in the small town, in the commonplace, so that at the right time he would deliver his people. And we know Paul says the same thing about Jesus. At the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Romans 5:6. Therefore, whatever time in your life you may be going through, whether it is dark and dreadful like the period of the Judges, know that the Lord is always working, always sovereign, and delights to deliver his people at just the right time. Be like Ruth today and take refuge under the wings of the Lord.